Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
James Turner walked into the bank with the weight of his day on his shoulders. The early afternoon sun outside streamed through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the marble floors. As he moved forward, the soft clack of his boots echoed through the cavernous space, sharp and deliberate, contrasting the quiet hum of the few patrons scattered around. His hand brushed the brim of his red MAGA hat as he stepped toward the counter, his eyes scanning the room, calculating. He'd always prided himself on being composed, but today felt different. His heart pulsed with a simmering tension. This was a test. The bank's manager, Karen, stood behind the counter with an air of aloofness, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto him. He could feel her gaze like a weight on his chest, heavy with judgment, though she hadn't said a word yet. He straightened up, pulling the brim of his hat just slightly lower, as if it could shield him from whatever storm might be coming. She wasn't subtle. Karen's thin lips curled into a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes, a look James had grown accustomed to over the years. She made no effort to mask her disdain, standing tall, her posture rigid, like a sentinel protecting some imagined fortress of virtue. The other customers, all of whom had been quietly attending to their business, now seemed to stiffen, watching the interaction unfold with nervous anticipation. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, the words sharp as daggers, each syllable coated in condescension. James hesitated, but only for a moment. "I need to apply for a business loan," he replied, his voice calm, even, despite the tension crackling in the air. He had done his research. This bank was where he had been managing his corporate accounts for years. It wasn't a high-risk loan. It was a routine matter. But Karen's cool reception suggested otherwise. She knew him, or at least she thought she did. Her eyes flickered over the MAGA hat once more, an unconscious narrowing of her gaze, before her lips parted in a practiced sneer. "I'm afraid we don't offer services to people like you." The words landed with a harshness that hit harder than anything he had anticipated. People like him? He blinked, momentarily taken aback by the sheer audacity. Her gaze wasn't just disapproving. It was dismissive. Her face had already closed itself off, no longer pretending to be polite. He could feel every eye in the room on him, the weight of their collective judgment bearing down on him, but none more so than Karen's. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone measured, but the chill in his voice betrayed a hint of the storm brewing within. "I said," she repeated slowly, as if speaking to a child, "we don't do business with people who wear those hats. We're a professional establishment." Her eyes flicked toward his head again, and her lips twitched in a barely concealed smirk. James felt his heart rate quicken, but he resisted the impulse to lash out. "I've been banking here for years," he said evenly. "I have a legitimate request. I'm not here to make a scene." Karen's expression hardened further. "Your request is denied," she snapped. "If you don't remove that hat and show respect, I'll have to call security. It's against our policy to tolerate people like you." The air seemed to thicken, charged with the venom of her words. He stared at her for a long moment, stunned by the boldness of her prejudice. The banality of her cruelty struck him like a slap to the face, as though he were being punished for something as harmless as his choice of headwear. For a moment he thought about walking away. Maybe that would be the end of it. A minor humiliation, in the grand scheme of things. But something inside him stirred, a quiet rage bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being dismissed so casually, not when he had built his success on hard work and perseverance. His mind raced. Should he just leave and report the incident later? No, that wasn't enough. He had come here for a reason, and he wasn't about to be driven away by an entitled bank manager. "I would like to speak to your superior," he said, his voice cold now, controlled. Karen's lips twisted into an even tighter smile. "You don't have the right to demand anything here," she retorted, folding her arms across her chest. "You can either take off that ridiculous hat and beg me for service, or you can leave." She stepped back, her posture dismissive, as if the matter was already settled. James didn't budge. The room felt smaller now, more suffocating. He could hear his heartbeat, louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of retreating. The tension in the room grew, and he could feel the eyes of the other customers boring into his back. But they were no help. Not one of them spoke up. No one even seemed to think that this was anything more than a minor disagreement. "I'm not leaving," James said firmly. "Call security if you must, but I'll be speaking with the manager." The words felt final, as though he was stepping into a new kind of battle. Karen's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, then returned colder, more mocking than before. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping furiously on the screen. James could hear the hum of her voice as she muttered into the phone, presumably explaining the situation to whoever was on the other end. She barely looked at him as she spoke, like he was a fly she was about to swat away. But as she spoke, the knot in his stomach tightened. This wasn't just about a loan anymore. This was something deeper, something that cut to the core of everything he believed in. He wasn't sure what he expected out of this encounter, but it was clear now that he wasn't just a customer here. To her, he was nothing more than a target for her misplaced arrogance, and that was something he couldn't let go. Domini. James stood in silence, his eyes fixed on Karen as she continued to speak on the phone, her words laced with condescension. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension in the room felt like a living thing, breathing in the space between them. His pulse hammered in his temples, but he refused to look away. He wasn't leaving, not now. The other customers in the bank had begun to shuffle nervously, exchanging furtive glances. It was as if they all felt the pressure of the situation, the heavy, uncomfortable atmosphere hanging over them. James wasn't sure whether they were rooting for him or merely afraid of drawing attention to themselves, but he wasn't concerned with their reactions. His mind was already a few steps ahead, formulating what came next. Karen ended the call with a snap of her fingers and turned to face him, her smug smile never wavering. She knew she held the power in this moment. It was clear in the way she looked at him, as though he were a nuisance she had the privilege of dismissing. "Security's on their way," she said, her voice dripping with a finality that made James's blood boil. Her words were a simple sentence, but they were loaded with a world of arrogance. James didn't respond immediately, but the corner of his mouth twitched in a barely perceptible smile. She had no idea what was coming. In the back of his mind, he knew that this was more than just a personal insult. She wasn't merely refusing to serve him, she was making a statement. She was using her position to reinforce a power dynamic, believing that her role as a bank manager could shield her from any consequences. James could see the way she regarded him now, not as a valued customer, not as someone deserving of respect, but as a problem to be solved. And in her eyes, solving the problem meant removing him from her sight. He remained still, his stance steady, as the minutes ticked by. His thoughts raced, but his exterior was composed, the practiced calm of a man used to high-stakes situations. This wasn't a moment for rage or rash decisions. He needed to think. He needed to outsmart her. Finally, 2 security guards appeared. At the entrance, their large figures looming as they strode toward him. The taller one, a broad-shouldered man with a hardened face, cast a quick glance at Karen before locking eyes with James. The look in his eyes was indifferent, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity. He'd clearly been briefed on the situation, but his training kept him neutral. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice firm but not hostile. James shifted his weight, giving a small nod. "I'm being denied service based on my appearance," he said, keeping his voice measured. "I would like to speak to the manager." The guard glanced over at Karen, who was now standing with her arms crossed, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. She met his gaze, a brief exchange that said everything. She had the power here. But the guard hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Karen was the one who broke the silence. "He's refusing to leave," she said, her tone carrying an edge of annoyance. "I've already asked him to leave, but he insists on staying and causing a scene." James looked back at her, his expression unwavering. "I'm not causing a scene," he replied calmly. "I'm simply requesting a service that I've been a customer of for years. But I'm being told that I'm not welcome here because of my political views." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the security guard's brow furrowed. He clearly hadn't expected this. Karen's face flushed slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. She shot him a look that James caught out of the corner of his eye, a look that clearly signaled him to follow her lead. The guard, still uncertain, turned to James. "You need to leave," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "If you're not willing to cooperate—" James cut him off, his voice cool and collected. "I'm not leaving until this is resolved." Karen, frustrated, snapped her fingers to get the guard's attention. "You're wasting time. Just remove him," she demanded. The guard hesitated, then took a step closer to James, his posture slightly shifting as though he were preparing for a confrontation. But James, calm as ever, raised his hand to stop him. "I'd suggest you rethink this," James said, his voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. "You're asking me to leave because of a hat. A hat. You're about to ask security to remove a paying customer, a long-time customer, because of a piece of clothing. Does that really sound reasonable to you?" The guard hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at Karen. For the briefest of moments, doubt flickered across his face. He seemed to weigh the situation, and for a split second, James thought he might back down. But Karen was quick to tighten, the reins, her eyes narrowing, sending a clear signal to the guard to act. "You don't have the right to question me," she said to James, her voice tight with irritation. "Leave now, or I'll have you escorted out." It was then that James felt the sharp sting of injustice in full force. It wasn't just about the loan anymore. It wasn't even about the hat. It was about the way Karen had dismissed him, belittled him, simply because she could. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. He didn't show it. His face remained an unreadable mask, but inside, his resolve hardened. If she thought she could push him around because of some petty, shallow judgment, she was gravely mistaken. He had resources, allies, and influence that she couldn't even begin to understand. He wasn't some random, faceless customer to be brushed aside. "Karen," he said, the coldness in his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't know who I am, do you?" She faltered for a fraction of a second, but her arrogance was swift to reclaim control. "I know enough to know that you're a troublemaker," she sneered. James didn't react to the insult. Instead, he smiled a thin, knowing smile. "No, you don't, but you're about to find out." He turned, his eyes locking with the security guards for the briefest moment, a silent understanding passing between them. The guard might not have been willing to back him, but he hadn't fully backed Karen either. James was already thinking 2 steps ahead, and his next move would be the one that changed everything. As he walked toward the door, he could feel Karen's gaze burning into his back, but he didn't flinch. The game had just begun. As James stepped outside the bank, the cool air hit his face like a slap. The wind tugged at the brim of his MAGA hat, but he ignored it, his steps brisk as he walked across the parking lot. His mind was racing, adrenaline still surging through his veins. But there was no panic, no uncertainty. He had been disrespected, humiliated in front of strangers, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. The door closed behind him with a finality that seemed to echo in his ears, and he stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure what had hurt more, the sting of Karen's words, or the way she had. Presumed to judge him based on something so trivial, so surface level. But either way, he had no intention of walking away from this without making her regret it. He reached for his phone, tapping the screen with a steady hand. A few quick searches, a few calls, and the plan was already forming in his mind. The bank might have been small in the grand scheme of things, but the people inside it, they weren't. Not by a long shot. Karen thought she was untouchable, safe behind her position of authority, but James had something far more powerful at his disposal: information. And once he had enough of it, he was going to make sure Karen would think twice before ever making such an arrogant mistake again. His fingers flew across the screen, sending messages to people he knew, people who owed him favors or simply respected him enough to help. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about sending a message. Karen had dismissed him because of something as simple as a hat. But what she didn't know was that James wasn't just another customer. He wasn't just a random man wearing a piece of clothing that riled her up. He was someone with a reach, with influence. As he stood there, waiting for the responses to trickle in, his thoughts wandered back to the confrontation inside. Karen had believed she was in control, like some high-ranking officer looking down on a mere civilian. But James knew something she didn't. People like her, people who let power go to their heads, were always the easiest to topple. It was only a matter of finding the right weakness, and he was good at that. He had spent years learning how to read people, how to find their cracks. And Karen? She had plenty. The first text came through, a simple reply from an old associate at a media firm. "Got it. Give me an hour and I'll have someone on the ground." James nodded to himself, the smile that tugged at his lips almost predatory. An hour. That was all it would take. The second message was even more promising. A friend from the legal world, someone with a penchant for defending the underdog, had already begun researching the bank's internal policies. Apparently, Karen's discrimination wasn't just a personal quirk. It was embedded in the culture of the institution. There were whispers, complaints from other customers who had experienced similar treatment. James knew that if he played this right, he wouldn't just expose Karen. He would expose the entire system that enabled her behavior. Another few minutes passed, and then the final piece clicked into place. A call from a reporter he'd worked with a few years back. "You're telling me a bank manager just kicked you out over a hat?" she asked, incredulous but intrigued. James could hear the sound of typing in the background. He had known from the start that if anyone would take his side, it would be someone like her. The press loved a scandal, and this was a scandal, plain and simple. She promised to have her team follow up with the bank and run an angle on the discriminatory behavior that was allegedly rampant among its employees. "Let's make sure Karen's little mistake is front-page news," she said with a chuckle. "We'll get the story out there." As he hung up, the puzzle pieces were all in place. Within hours, the bank would be under scrutiny. Within days, Karen would have no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. She thought she was untouchable, but James knew better. The fall from grace was always faster than people realized, especially when the world was watching. He turned toward his car, feeling the weight of what was to come settle in his chest. The initial anger had given way to a sharp, focused determination. This wasn't just about payback. It was about making sure that no one else had to endure what he had. It was about holding people like Karen accountable for their behavior. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Driving back toward his office, James replayed the interaction in his mind, her smug face, the condescending tone, the way she had assumed she could throw him out without so much as a second thought. And, yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized something important. It wasn't just Karen he was up against. It was a system, a culture that allowed people like her to exist without fear of retribution. A culture that believed a title could shield someone from accountability. But James had played that game before. He had been on both sides of the power dynamic. He knew how to make it work for him. The car's engine hummed as he navigated through traffic, his mind moving faster than the vehicle. Every move he made from here on out had to be calculated. Timing was everything. If he moved too quickly, it would look like a personal vendetta. If he waited too long, people would lose interest, and the momentum would fizzle. He needed to keep the pressure on Karen to make sure she never saw it coming. By the time he pulled into his parking spot, his phone was buzzing again with updates. The reporter had already drafted a story, and the legal team was ready to make a statement. His associates in media were spreading the word, making sure that everyone who needed to know about Karen's behavior would hear it loud and clear. He sat back in his seat, the sense of satisfaction creeping in. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. And he would make sure Karen learned the hard way that no one was above reproach, not even someone in her position. James took a deep breath and smiled. It was time to watch the storm unfold. The following morning, James woke early, the weight of what he had set in motion hanging in the air. He could feel the steady rhythm of anticipation building within him, a quiet but persistent hum that kept his thoughts sharp. Today would be the day everything came to a head. The pieces were already in motion. He had people on the inside, the press hungry for a story, and Karen completely unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at his reflection. The man staring back at him was calm, composed. His blue eyes, usually so warm, were hard now, focused. James knew the role he was about to play, both on the battlefield of corporate injustice and in the eyes of those who would watch this unfold. It wasn't about the victory anymore. It was about the message. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or judged for something as trivial as a hat, a shirt, a belief. He dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit that made him look both professional and unapproachable. He wanted to strike the right balance of authority and unassuming confidence. As he left his apartment, his phone buzzed with a series of updates. The media outlets were ready, his contacts in the press had circled back, and everything was in place. The storm was closing in. By mid-morning, the first article was live. The headline screamed across social media, "Bank manager refuses service to customer over MAGA hat. Is this discrimination?" The story was brief but impactful, drawing attention to the incident and providing just enough context to stir curiosity. And that was all it needed to start the chain reaction. Comments poured in from all sides, outraged, questioning, supportive, and critical. But the one thing they all had in common was that they were engaged. James sat back in his office, watching the responses trickle in. He wasn't just a bystander in this narrative anymore. He was the architect, watching with satisfaction as his plan unfolded with precision. Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. And yet, there she was, still in the dark, at her desk, probably scrolling through emails and preparing to ignore whatever had been happening outside of her immediate bubble. But the storm was already upon her. By noon, the first wave of phone calls hit the bank, angry customers, concerned citizens, and, predictably, several news outlets asking for statements. The bank's HR department had already started an internal investigation into the incident, and someone had leaked a snippet of Karen's internal correspondence to the press. The story was gaining momentum faster than anyone could have anticipated. James's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his media contact. "The local TV station is running the story at 5. Expect them to contact you for an interview. They want to go live with this tonight." He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of precision, a smile that said this was only the beginning. The afternoon dragged on as James waited for Karen's inevitable reaction. He wasn't concerned. The backlash was already too great for her to ignore. By the time the evening news broadcast aired, Karen would be facing a full-fledged public relations disaster, and her arrogant dismissal of him would be exposed for what it was, an abuse of power that could no longer be overlooked. Finally, as the day began to fade into the evening, James's phone buzzed with a new notification, an email from Karen herself. He chuckled softly, reading the message with a faint sense of irony. "We've seen your little stunt in the media. You think you can just destroy someone's life for a hat? You don't know who you're messing with. I'll have you fired. You'll never work in this town again." It was exactly the kind of response he had expected, predictable, defensive, and utterly out of touch. Karen still didn't understand. This wasn't about him. This was about the way she had used her position to wield power over someone she deemed inferior. James wasn't just a man in a hat anymore. He was a symbol of everything she had misunderstood and misused. As night fell, the phone rang. It was Karen, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "This is just the beginning. I have connections." "I'll make sure you regret this." James let her rant, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her escalating anger. "Karen," he said, cutting her off with a single word. "You have no idea what you've started. You're about to be the face of everything that's wrong with your industry. Your behavior is about to be on every screen, in every home. You've made a mistake, one you won't walk away from." There was a beat of silence, a hesitation before she spoke again. "This isn't over. I'll find a way to ruin you." James leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Karen, the truth is already out there, and you'll be the one trying to cover it up. You've lost. It's just a matter of how badly you want the fall to hurt." The phone clicked, her frustration palpable in the dead silence that followed. By the time the newscaster's voice echoed through James's TV, he was already watching the latest broadcast. He saw Karen's face plastered across the screen, her pride shattered as she tried to salvage a sinking reputation. The bank had issued a public apology, but it was clear to anyone watching that the damage had been done. Karen was no longer the confident manager in her glass tower. She was a woman on the defensive, her every word scrutinized and doubted. James watched with a sense of satisfaction, but also with the realization that this was only the first part of the plan. The world would see her crumble, but that wasn't enough. He wanted her to feel the weight of her own arrogance, the fallout from her own decisions. As the segment ended, a final clip appeared on screen. Karen exiting the bank, her head held low, surrounded by reporters. She had come to work that morning with the power to shape others' lives, but now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. James reached for his phone one last time, sending a single text to his contact at the media firm. Make sure they see the full story. Let everyone know the name of the bank. The game was over. And James? He had won.